everyone. Thank you for joining us for the REMI Client Series on Energy and Environmental Policy. My name is Dee Scott, Marketing Administrator here at REMI, and I have the pleasure of serving as your webinar host this afternoon. Kicking off our client webinar series will be Dr. Jim Robey, Principal at Robey Analytics, LLC, a professional consulting firm specializing in economic development, workforce development, and site selection services. Dr. Robey is an applied economist, economic developer, and site selection consultant with over 30 years of experience. He has worked for corporate, nonprofit, economic, and workforce development organizations in problem-solving, strategy, and policy decision-making from the local to the national levels. His analysis, economic impact modeling, and site selection experience spans over several projects and papers. Prior experience includes directing regional research initiatives, economic development, and site selection at nonprofit and for-profit entities. Dr. Robey earned his Ph.D. in urban studies with an emphasis on economic development and his master's degree in public administration from Cleveland State University, Levin College of Urban Affairs. Following the discussion, all registrants for today's presentation will receive direct access to the webinar slides and recording via follow-up email, so please keep an eye out for that. Again, if you would like to ask questions during the presentation, please feel free to submit them on the Q&A submission portal on your screen, and Dr. Robey will answer them following his discussion. At this time, I will hand it off to Dr. Robey to begin the presentation.
Hi, thanks so much, Dee, and thanks for taking the time to listen in today on how we've thought about thinking about estimating the impacts of a wind energy project. This project is in Michigan, and the origin of this started a number of years ago, actually, when I was with the Upjohn Institute, where we did, as Dee said, applied regional economic development activities and research. In fact, I am in the process of finishing this project up. It is continue to take some time to work through this. I will not be sharing any sort of results with you today, but really how we thought about it and how we use REMI and why REMI is important to us. This probably will sound like a commercial for REMI, but it's not intended to be, but it is my preferred model over the last 25 or 26 years of doing this type of work. So as we go to this first slide, we'll see that the study was, the client is actually a county-based economic development organization. And so we're working through them, but the funder actually was the developer of the project, Apex Clean Energy. And the data that we're working with today were supplied by the developer. And let me say that when you do these sorts of things, there are ways to do it that make it much more bulletproof. Again, I'm not here necessarily to sell for REMI, but I think using REMI is one way to make this much more bulletproof. The second way is to have very good data that you can point to. And this developer has experience in Michigan and across the country. And so as they set out pro formas on a number of areas that we'll talk about today, I think it was particularly useful. And then probably also important is by working with the developer, you've got a client that can tell you what the data mean. And so in looking at natural accounts or other spreadsheets and other sorts of data across different types of studies, whether they be universities or energy studies or mixed use development, having good quality data and understanding what it means and how it gets distilled into REMI is incredibly important. A couple of assumptions about this study: it's a 31-year cycle. And I get a little bit nervous about that. The build out is in year 1, and then years from 2 to 31 are periods of operations, tax collection, and payments to landowners. And I'll talk about each of those separately. So looking at this next slide, excuse me. A couple things. Why REMI? And again, I pay to use REMI. They are not paying me in any way to do this. But there is a free model that if you want to do this, it's from the National Renewable Energy Labs, does offer a free model. It's called JEDI, and it's on Jobs and Economic Development Impact is what JEDI stands for. I think it's a bit, it's based on IMPLAN, and I do use IMPLAN also, although REMI is my preferred model, but I think it's a very simplistic model. The thing that I liked about using REMI for this is maybe first and foremost, before I get farther into this, is that it's a 31-year cycle, and many of the other models really don't do forecasting out that far and that well. I know you're going to hear from some of my colleagues in this series later, and they look at some of these things 60 and 100 years out. I know when we met at the users meeting this year in Florida, was talking with the folks from Louisiana Department of Transportation. They're thinking about investments that last 50 and 100 years, and so REMI is important for that. Another reason this model was custom configured, I was at the Upjohn Institute. We had a 30+ region model, including one model for just this county, which allowed us to do the county, the rest of Michigan, and the rest of the US, because there are investments in all of these areas based on a very large project, just under $500 million worth of investment. I think this is important from the fact that given the economic concepts of economic geographies from Krugman and trade flows and other things, that where these investments go and how they interact with each other can have important rippling effects. We use the most current baseline data, as you know, using University of Michigan. Sorry out there, anybody that's a Buckeye. But University of Michigan data for the short run forecast, the CBO for longer run forecast, and BLS for longer run forecast. We know that we have probably the best available baseline data to use in REMI based on current COVID conditions. And so rather than using a model from 2019 or something like that, we actually are using both baseline models for the nation and for the region that are probably the most current thinking based on economic conditions. Again, we can do time series over the event horizon of 31 years. And, you know, maybe one of the most important thing is, and I find this maybe more troubling with other models than REMI, is the kind of quality support and consulting that we get from REMI. Work closely with Chris Judson and lots of other folks in thinking about, you know, are we thinking about this the right way? Here are these data. How should we model this? REMI has many policy concepts built into it, a lot of policy levers. And I think the ability to use those appropriately, particularly given detailed data from the client, integrating those is really, really important. So looking at this next slide, why this type of study matters. These are increasingly important across the country. There probably are some places, and where I used to live in Ohio, it's probably not a great wind opportunity outside of maybe offshore wind, but in places like Michigan, these are really, really important things for a number of reasons. But this recent report that came out in August from the Department of Energy through the Berkeley Labs really do outline the growth in wind, and the forecast is continued as renewable energy portfolio standards occur across the country. And so there really is a need for this type of understanding of how it can benefit communities. Looking at this next slide. The components of the analysis, there were 4 separate impacts estimated, and then we added them together, and I'll explain why we didn't run them all together. There are some aspects of REMI that probably are appropriate, but it is, you've got to think about it when you do it. The first is the build out. It was construction of the project. The second one was 30 years of operations and maintenance, which is quite cyclical. Then there are lease payments, and so there are payments to landowners, more than 400 families in this particular county. And these folks that were getting lease payments also were folks that maybe were inconvenienced, for lack of a better phrase, that they had properties adjacent to some of the wind farms. Some of the parcels with wind energy on them, wind generators on them. And so then also personal property tax collections. So again, 4 were build out, operations and maintenance, payments to landowners and leaseholders, as well as property tax collections based in real personal property. So running these together provides interesting but not necessarily useful results, as you might expect. If you shock a large investment in a small county in a single year, in the next years, you're going to have declining returns that'll show up as negative. And so when you net those out and you run those all together, you may get somewhat false results as the model for the build out sort of looks negative for 10 years or so afterwards. But when you have O&M, lease payments, and personal property tax collections, over that next 30 years, you're going to have positive results. And so what I chose to do there, and I've thought about it, and I think it's the right way to do it, is to add the results of the individual runs rather than accumulate them as a single set of runs because of the negative impact of the kind of negative shock in the out years for the build out of the project. Next, please. So the build out, the client had experience in the state as well as across the country in these types of projects. And in particular, they had just completed in another county a wind farm project, and they were able to take direct data. Now, the interesting thing about the build out is while that there are estimates of the size of the turbine and the height of the turbine and the turbines and the cost of the turbines themselves, the reality is that until it's time to actually do these 2, 3, 4 years from now to actually do the build out, the actual cost and the actual provider, whether it's Vestas, GE, or someone else, that decision will be made at that time, and that has impacts on the longer run operations and maintenance also. But based on experience, the client could allocate spending for materials and labor to 3 REMI regions, the target county, the rest of the state. And here we necessarily, as I mentioned, we had a 30+ region model. We necessarily used spreader for those additional impacts, investments, both in employment and indirects. And one thing that we did here was we did not, because maybe more unlike the JEDI model with InPlan, which is kind of tailored to doing this wind project, there isn't a real clear path to doing a wind project in REMI. And so it really took, again, some thinking, some consulting with the REMI folks to actually shock. And so many things that might have been thought as in normal situations or consistently, so supply chain issues are probably brought into direct impacts from the indirects, because we knew that concrete, rebar, and other things would be direct, and we knew the spending on that, and so we shocked the model directly on that. Again, target county, rest of state, and then rest of the United States. And in that DOE report I mentioned from August of last year, there is a good discussion around how much of wind farms are being supplied domestically and how much internationally, keeping in mind again that REMI does have regional purchase coefficients that can be tapped into, particularly at the national level, that look at the import substitution effect. We did condense hard and soft costs for the project into a single year event. We really didn't know how much of this would have been time -1 or time -2, or how much might bleed over into time +1. And so we probably overestimate in a single year the impacts, but really if you aggregated the build out, it probably is a fair representation by combining them all into 1 year. So looking at this next slide, we thought about this build out again from a SWOT standpoint. The client had a solid pro forma based on experience in the state. Based on that experience, they were able to better allocate investment into the 3 regions. Again, I mentioned the DOE report based on state-based and national supply chain. We did believe supply chain existed in Michigan, and we believe supply chain existed in the other 50 states. Again, as I mentioned, one of the weaknesses, the choice of materials, providers, inputs is based on price and availability at the time of construction, and that's 2 to 3 years out. And so these are always need to be referred to as best estimates of the system. Looking at the next slide. I did mention the domestic sourcing. This comes from, again, the DOE report. And so there was support for the client's pro forma to allocate dollars into the rest of the state and to the rest of the United States. And again, on the RPC side, we did leave some of that on the national to REMI to decide how much of that would be self-supplied and how much would be imported. So looking at this next slide. The domestic supply chain, the report once again broke down the 2020 domestic supply chain, that somewhere between 80 to 100% of nacelles were supplied domestically. Wind towers were 60 to 80% supplied domestically, and some of the blades and hubs were less than 50% supplied domestically. And so again, we felt comfortable that between the allocation of investment by the client as well as the RPCs within the model, that we had a good estimation of what was going on in the target county. So looking at the next slide, excuse me. One of the weaknesses, again, is the actual sourcing of materials is based on price points at time of construction. As I mentioned, REMI doesn't have an exact fit plug and play for wind farms. I think that's where some of this becomes the art of doing these type of things, is that there isn't just a simple plug and play. And it really does take thought of you working with your clients to think about that. Based on detailed inputs and region allocations from the client, we do a best fit of activities. And as I mentioned, we push much of the supply chain or the indirects into the directs. This is always confusing, and I know in 2.5.0, there's a much better discussion within REMI on direct, indirect, and induced. We were using a 2.4 model because, as I mentioned, we started this project a couple years ago. And so we stayed with that model because it was configured appropriately for the study, which was this county and then other counties in the state and then the rest of the US. So we were able to push this out in a way that was probably a little confusing. And one of the issues that the client had was they were used to working with people who use this JEDI implant-based model, and the direct, indirect, and induced appeared to be relatively simply defined. Yet working within REMI, there's a process. Working with the consultants at REMI, we're able to get to those numbers too, but they looked a little higher on the direct side and a little lower on the indirect side due to, again, pushing everything into the direct side of the equation. Looking at the next slide. This got interesting, and I always get a little nervous when we start looking at 30-year event horizons. But this year began in year 2 and went out to year 31. And this was for operations and maintenance. Again, the client had an interesting pro forma. It was relatively detailed. A couple caveats to it is that the actual O&M that occurs will be based on something we talked about a couple slides ago, which is who's the provider of the hardware. And so different GE versus Gamesa versus Vestas will have different cycles for maintenance and repair. And so it's very cyclical over that time. And so when you're reporting it, it gets sort of interesting. But again, the client was able to determine how much of this product and labor was allocated to the target community as well as the rest of Michigan. Based on idiosyncrasies of the initial build model, each product base has a different set of costs. I already mentioned that, and schedules. And costs and labor vary over time. It's a very bumpy type of thing, as you might imagine if you think about your own personal vehicle, unless you're driving an EV. You know, at 60,000 miles, you may do a particular service that you didn't do at 50,000 miles or at 40,000 miles, but there may be a big service that you do at 30,000 miles. And this is the way it is with these. And also in the maintenance side of it, are ongoing monitoring. And so they're interesting as they talk about this because there's a centralized data collection point for the owners of these, because most of these get handed off to a utility to be used. And so there's a lot of Internet of Things going on here, where there are data centers and data scientists using these data, monitoring them so they can be sure that operations and any necessary maintenance is occurring. So looking at the next slide. This was sort of interesting. This was all around lease payments. Again, lease payments are made to landowners, and others possibly impacted by activities. Keeping in mind that not only will there be wind farms, be towers and nacelles up, which there are differing views on the impact of those on property values, on quality of life, on birds and other things. But there's also a lot of collection activities. And so there's collection wires, there's collection transformers and substations, and then feeding into the large power lines that you see. And so as we were thinking about how this goes into the model, I have to thank my good friend and colleague at University of Michigan, RSQE, Don Grimes, for suggesting that we think about it as transfer payments from corporations. Due to the large number, more than 400 families affected by this, we were uncertain whether this would be treated as additional income or it would be treated as windfall profits. And so Sarah Mills, in her doctoral dissertation, she's now at University of Michigan, looked into some of these things, and they did find that investment tended to be higher in farms and other places that had wind farms than non-wind farms. This was based in survey data. You can look her up. She did some really great research around 2014 on this, but we went with a non-windfall assumption, given that these payments be distributed across many people, and we thought it would be treated as normal income with some savings. But it's also possible that if there were large landowners, that they might treat that as a windfall. The one interesting thing that did come out of it, without revealing too much about this, is normally if you look at a REMI output, you'll see that output is greater than value added, which is greater than personal income. And I had to stop and think when I saw this, because the lease payments in a small rural county far exceeded the ability of people to consume locally. And so much of the consumption probably was imported into the county, and so output and value added were much smaller than the actual value of personal income from lease payments. So it was an interesting result that you don't often see, but necessarily with large amounts of cash flowing into these people on a year-over-year basis, it's quite likely that some of their dollars did get expended outside the county. So looking at this next slide. Personal property taxes, and this got interesting for me. Again, mentioning that that the client had a lot of experience in Michigan. They had some pretty good pro formas. There were 18 or 20 entities, from townships to school districts to community college districts to special districts like libraries and ambulance and sheriff, that were going to be taxed on this. So the first bullet point is probably the trickiest, that the tax structure for personal property, as this large investment is a moving target in Michigan. And trying to get someone to give us a good pro forma depreciation schedule was not doable. I talked to the assessors, who are the auditors, called auditors in other places. I talked to people, accountants. I could not get a clear picture on this. Fortunately, based on other experience and applying it to the target county, the client was able to, based on current legislation, and that could change in 2022, and therein lies one of the dangers of doing estimates over 30 years, is things could change. It was based on project experience in other areas of the state, so they had some pretty good insights into how the tax structure overall and depreciation in the state of Michigan currently worked. And I emphasize in quotes and with exclamation points, currently, I think, is a huge issue. current rates for each taxable entity. That can change, that can go up, that can go down. It just depends on renewal levies and other things. And again, the tax base is quite varied, and collection entities include county, townships, school districts, and I mentioned them earlier. Weaknesses over the 30-year event horizon are changes in legislation, changes in rates, changes in tax structure, and changes in depreciation. It is interesting, and had good conversations with the REMI folks about how to take these public dollars and model them, because they exist outside of the build, the O&M, or the lease payments. These were actually known dollars to be spent in the public sector, keeping in mind that, at least within NAICS codes, that public education, both at the higher education level and K through 12, is part of public administration. And so some decisions had to be made about how those dollars were spent and what it looked like from the standpoint of how those dollars were being spent. Were they spent like education, or were they spent by local government? And so in thinking about that, again, some more art maybe than science. So thinking about the next slide. So tricks to the results, and not tricks to trick anybody, but some ways to think about the results. Run each report component separately. Again, the other three get overshadowed by the build out in years 2 through 11 due to the shock of such a huge investment in a 1-year time. So for that reason, we summed rather than single run for combined reporting. And results are bumpy. And so in a lot of cases, what we did was report data on an average basis rather than an annual basis. Although in the appendix, we did put our estimates for each of the 30 years of O&M, which is cyclical. Lease payments interacted with the personal consumption expenditure indexes, which meant that using nominal dollars and relatively flat lease payments, that in the end, you get, of course, depreciating. And of course, this does not even account for some of the recent inflation that we've seen. It really does start to look at declining returns from lease payments because they're not escalated up, but relatively flat in this case. And again, personal property tax collections are based on current thinking, and that could change to either increase, decrease, or stay the same. And so all of these combine to give a great set of estimates, but certainly nothing that someone can't look at 10 years from now and said, well, you said this, but this is what really happened. That's the nature of trying to, excuse me, estimate public activities in public markets. So looking at the next slide. More results. Again, we both reported them individually in the report, each separately, and then combined them. We did report jobs as an annual average over 30 years, excluding the build out, because that was 1 year and it was so big, we didn't want to skew the results, so it would be so skewed. But output, value added, and personal income can be reported in the table as some dollars, because those dollars do accumulate. So we reported the incomes, those three: value added, income, and output for build out. We looked at the 30-year horizon, and then again we had a 31-year table in the appendix that allowed us to look at that over the time and really sum up the returns. In fact, in one of the reviews that we got back from one of our clients' consultants, they said, you know, you really need a table that outlines investment and returns in both the executive summary and the conclusion. And after we're done speaking today, that's my next thing to work on. So looking at the next slide. Sourcing build out assumes that all out of state spending is domestic. We know that's not the case. We know there'll be imports, but again, isn't that what the RPCs are for? Lease payments, again, yield an interesting result, and that personal income is significantly larger than value added and output. The actual distribution of payments to families is unknown, so how recipients will treat these dollars is unknown. We treated them as normal income. It is possible, again, looking at the work that Sarah Mills has done at University of Michigan, that some of that may actually be somewhat windfall. from personal property taxes, treated as normal revenues in the model, but may yield some windfall spending. The intent there is we don't know how school districts will use, say they get another $2 million a year. Will they build a new stadium? Will the sheriff's department get new vehicles? Will the fire department get a new truck? And that's some of the stuff that Sarah talked about in her work, is that, these one-time events and these ongoing events may change consumption behavior on a personal property tax section by public entities as they have monies that they weren't expecting. Looking at the next slide. In the end, even with great developer-driven data, outcomes and forecasts from REMI need to be treated as estimates. I almost want to just cut and paste estimate into almost everything I say. Of course, if someone looks back at this in 2051 or 2052 or 2053, they can look back and say, well, you said this was going to happen, it didn't. But a lot of things can happen over a 30-year event horizon. One, local and state tax incidents can change, depreciation schedules at the state and federal level can change, and how it's affecting both personal property as production and personal property from utilities. Customer behavior could be influenced by inflation. And so one of the things that we don't know, in our current modeling is what's the long run impact of consumption behavior by people through COVID, and now with inflation at a 30-year high, what does that mean going forward? And all we can do is use what's in the models to our best estimates. This type of event does meet a but-for standard of economic development. If you think about it, were it not for this $500 million investment in this somewhat rural county, it's unlikely that a lot of these dollars would have flowed there, whether they're personal dollars, personal property tax dollars, or other things. And really, in the end, many places, including the state of Michigan in 2021, and I believe it went up in it's going up in 2022, required that 15% of energy be produced from renewables. So there's a regulation and policy support supports demand for this type of investment, and helping the local folks understand how this can be positive is, I think, important. Again, we're not out there to be boisterous for anybody, but to give them our best estimates based on data and forecasts for the areas that we talked about, to give them the best sort of information. The next slide, please. That's me. Feel free to call me. Feel free to email me. Always glad to, I think the strength of what we do working with REMI is the users. And so not only the staff and the availability of staff at REMI, but also all of us talking to each other. Again, I mentioned Don Grimes at University of Michigan, Gabe Ehrlich, his boss and partner is a good partner of mine. So talking through things with folks, I think is the best way to get good and accurate, reliable results. Dee, back to you, and thanks for taking the time to listen today.